Well, welcome back to Ye Olde, guys, and our special series on the growth and development of cities. The reason I love doing this podcast, and I love learning from the research that Daniel does, especially in this special series, is we learn about how our cities came to be, the complex forces at work which explain the layout, the patterns, the populations, and even the traffic congestion, the artistry and the atmosphere that we see today. We learn about how we got here. We've mentioned a great book on this podcast, Francis Pryor's Making of the British Landscape. We've mentioned it a few times. What I love about this book, it makes me see the British landscape in a different way. And that's what we're trying to do with this series. So without putting too much pressure on you, Daniel, I'm hoping this episode will help make us look at English towns and cities slightly differently, because today we're talking about an underappreciated and perhaps undersold era. Today we're talking about the Tudor and Stuart periods. Welcome back, Daniel, and another exciting episode about an undersold period in the urban development of English towns and cities.
Yep, that's right. Probably one of the most famous general periods of English history. We all learn about Tudors and Stuarts when we're young, but do we actually learn about the impact on English towns and cities? I think perhaps less than other eras. And we'll talk a bit more about that gap and where it fits in and why this era is so important to the development of English towns and cities a bit later on. But
I'm looking forward to it, Daniel. But before we do, we've got some correspondence. We've got a message from Terry, who listened to our Reading episode, and he had an interesting point about the battle that you spoke about in the centre of Reading and some of the historical context. Do you want to just talk about that a bit?
Yeah, Terry was kind enough quite some time ago, actually, to give us some feedback on our Reading episode. It's very pertinent for this episode, as it's about the Glorious Revolution specifically. So it provides some nice context for one of the important events we talk about later in this episode. Terry was very, very nice about the episode. He's a bit of an expert himself on Reading history. I say a bit of an expert, a lot of an expert, actually, far more than I am. And he agreed that Reading's a town which massively undersells its history and really can exceed your expectations, which is exactly what we concluded.
Yeah, agreed.
And he commented on our coverage of the Battle of Broad Street in Reading town centre. It's really that, if you don't know Reading, it's the main high street shopping street through the town centre. And we mentioned this in that episode as being really the only battle of any substance during the Glorious Revolution in 1688, when William III became the last person to successfully invade England and take the throne alongside his wife, Mary II. And this battle, despite being small scale, may have even helped convince James he couldn't win because he'd lost to a greater force at this point and the people had turned against him. This is very relevant, as I said, for our episode today. Terry did challenge our characterisation of the Glorious Revolution as an invasion of England by William. He made the very good argument that William was invited by parliamentarians to usurp a very unpopular incumbent king in James II. And there was no real fighting at all apart from this Battle of Broad Street in Reading, which wasn't a huge military event. I think Terry makes really good points, and I'm pretty sure, although it was a long time ago, we were certainly careful to apply caveats about the extent of the fighting in Reading. But I would actually stick to the description of 1688 as an invasion. William may have received an invitation from leading parliamentarians, and this was very important. But I think the idea that he just strolled into the country to universal acclaim by Parliament and by the public is a bit of a myth. The so-called invitation to William was only signed by 7 parliamentarians. While undoubtedly they had much broader support, there was certainly no Act of Parliament or upfront legal authorisation for William to take the crown. Legal authorisation was only really applied later in almost kind of in hindsight, when James was adjudged to have abdicated when he ran away and Parliament legally gave the crown to William and Mary jointly. And even more than that, William was clearly anticipating at least the possibility of a fight. The military forces he brought with him were larger than the entire force of the Spanish Armada. David Starkey lists some 60 warships, 700 transports, 15,000 troops, 4,000 horses, all paid up in advance, anticipating fighting. And while, of course, the initial fighting was almost non-existent, James did have an army, so he could have chosen to resist, and nearly did at one point, instead of fleeing. And fighting between William and James did take place in Ireland in the coming years, including the famous Battle of the Boyne. So I do stick to it. I do think it's reasonable to describe a hostile takeover of this kind as an invasion. But I do agree it's an arguable point and certainly appreciate the message.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of people say that William the Conqueror was the last time that Britain was invaded. But I remember in this episode, you made this point that we did have this soft invasion. Is that a fair characterization?
It was an invasion that people welcomed, I think. I think had there not been so much support, William would have struggled to get it done or even launch the invasion in the first place. So, yeah, I think an invasion that was all right with the people, I think you'd say.
So a good reason to visit Reading, of course, is to see the place where this happened. You can also see a copy of the Bio Tapestry in Reading.
That's right,
If you don't want to queue to see the real thing, which is coming to the UK apparently soon, you can see a copy in Reading Museum. I wonder if you'll be able to tell the difference.
It runs all the way around the second floor. They do guided tours every Saturday afternoon. I sometimes see them. I think I'm right in saying that when the copy was made, some of the more obscene parts were censored out by the kind of offensive to the modern sensibilities of the ladies who made it. So you might be able to tell the difference there if you're looking closely.
So lots of good reasons to visit Reading, and you can check out our episode on the history of Reading, which exceeded expectations, as I recall, and scored rather highly on our scoring system as a result. But today, let's get back to what we're talking about today. We're talking about the development of Tudor and Stuart cities. First of all, why does this period matter so much in the growth of English towns and cities?
Well, when you think of the history of English towns and cities, I think many people's minds will do kind of a mental leap over this period. In your mind, you'll have an image of the mud, the castles and the timber of the Middle Ages. And then you might have an idea of the later kind of neoclassical architecture and plan designs of Georgian towns. But this in-between bit is maybe overlooked, but a critical period between those two eras. It has hallmarks of both. You still have crumbling castles, muddy streets and timbering construction mainly, particularly at the beginning of this period. But you also have just the beginnings of towns and cities as they appear to us today, and the genesis of much of the larger urban growth in construction we saw in the later Georgian and Victorian eras. You also have revolutions in the fabric of buildings themselves, and while the developments of this era were predominantly more in individual building styles than wholesale revolutions in the formal shape of towns, the earliest ideas of modern neoclassical town planning in urban squares and streets were brought in from abroad and developed, particularly in areas of London in this period.
So we're seeing this town planning. What sort of era are we talking about? Just to be really clear, what are the dates that we're talking about?
Yeah, I would add that element of town planning was very limited. I probably shouldn't over-egg it too much, mainly limited to London, but certainly the earliest ideas of it were definitely there and caught on later. What's our scope? Well, we're going to cover the period from around 1500 up to around 1700. Strictly, the Stuart era ended in 1714, I think. But this cut-off is really before industrialisation started to radically transform the country in the early 18th century. So while this was certainly a period of change, it was really the last era before Britain became the world's first modern industrialised urban nation. And thematically, we're going to have some overlap with the medieval Towns and Cities episode we did before. So we'll try not to cover too much old ground. We're going to talk more, particularly in the second part of this episode, about changes in English towns since then. We'll be mentioning London a bit more this time. We're normally more concerned with provincial towns and cities on this podcast, but some of the ventures in urban planning that we've mentioned, the piazzas and squares of Covent Garden and the West End, were so innovative that we do need to mention them.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, this period, 1500 to 1700, could you just give us a very, very brief overview of the political context? Some of it is very well known, very famous, but you just give the highlights really of what was going on in the country at the time.
Certainly. So from a political perspective, this really was a time of religious extremes and upheaval. Well, little in that respect stood still for more than a short time. Under the Tudors, you had Henry VIII's beginning of the Reformation and dissolution of the monasteries, and they had a colossal impact on urban society. You had the Church of England settlement, concluding arguments under Henry's children, the religious and political disputes of the Civil War, which ravaged English towns, and then what you can only describe as the kind of extreme zealotry of the Puritan regime during the interregnum after the Civil War and before the Restoration. More broadly than that, you had explorers going around the world and beginning permanent settlements overseas. This was really the beginning of British settlement overseas in that period of empire building and Britain's rise to great global power. But this was generally more a time of military and political threat than of expansion. We're familiar with the external threat of invasion, which ran closest with the Spanish Armada, but there were internal dangers and destabilizations as well, with almost innumerable plots against successive monarchs and governments. Plus, of course, the Civil War, the last major military action on the ground in England to date. That was followed by the restoration of the monarchy, the union of the British crowns, though not yet political union, the Glorious Revolution, and more stability, which, coming after 2 centuries of really uncertainty and unease of life in England, did impact urban culture and the context in which people were able to think about building for their futures.
Yeah, so you've got these big political moments, but what did it mean for society? What was life actually like for people?
So while we will be talking up the developments from the Middle Ages in this episode, this is definitely still a pre-modern world that we're talking about. There was little major technological development in this time. We do see the beginnings of early industry and transport management, which would change the country utterly from the 18th century. Socially, there was also almost unthinkable religious intolerance, especially persecution of Catholics. This was the era when we saw the burning of heretics and witches by people who genuinely believed they were doing God's holy work. And of course, these religious divides and extremes were critical factors in the outbreak of the Civil War. For everyone, life expectancy could still be very low. You might expect to live until just your early 30s if you were living at the end of the 16th century. And this did mean, this is a point people don't think about enough, I think, that England was a very young country. 22 was the median age in Elizabethan England. Imagine a town where the median age of everyone walking around is early 20s, barely out of university. Today, it's closer to 40. And this probably means that towns felt a lot more probably immature and youthful than they do today. And Ian Mortimer has observed that people also looked younger, not just because they were, but most men didn't start to grow beards until they're in their 20s. And frankly, you and I would probably be considered at the start of old age, our age now.
Ancient by those standards.
Would be old men, yeah. You also had catastrophes that seem completely alien to us now in England, and they still happened with some regularity. Infant mortality was about 20% as late as the 1680s. There could be mortal starvation if your crops failed. There were plagues, not just bubonic, that was still going on, but others like plagues of influenza. And all of these tragedies were there and evident in the sights and experiences and the lives of urban England. Despite this, the population of England did grow by about 30% between 1560 to 1600 and more later. And this specific period up to 1600 was the first major population growth for a century. And that was mainly because generally there was increasing availability of food. Many of these people were in towns and cities. These aren't the same astonishing rates of growth that you experienced later in industrial England, but still a notable and sizable increase in the number of people living in towns.
So we're seeing a little bit of technological change, but nothing like a revolution. We're seeing population growth, so you're saying 30%, 1560 to 1600, so it's pretty fast, but still nothing like the explosion later. What about cultural change and artistic change?
Well, this was an important period in that respect, because this is the time when the Renaissance really hit England, again, imported from Europe. And consequently, this is maybe the first time in Europe where you might have considered that human achievements, the achievements of the society and culture around you, were starting to match up to and perhaps exceed the ancient examples of the Greeks and Romans, which had been hanging over Europe as kind of the heights of culture for centuries. At the highest levels of society, you had Renaissance art, architecture and music. You also had writers like Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, and despite the backdrop of religious zealotry, which we've talked about, you do have the rise of rational thinking as well, with scientific learning just starting to permeate the more traditional and religious views of the world. The latter part of this era, it's the age of Newton, Boyle and Hooke. Well, at the end of this period, the turmoil of the Civil War and Restoration, culminating with the Glorious Revolution, gave us greater liberties from tyranny and just those first little seeds of a modern representative democracy, though we were still a long way from that point then.
I find that idea fascinating, that your society always looked back to this ancient period in which things were more advanced or appeared more advanced. And I suppose that was particularly true in what survived of urban structures and buildings as well, which I suppose this is the era when you're starting to look towards reaching that point again. So let's get back to towns. So one of my favourite questions on the podcast is about population size, most important cities. So what was the hierarchy of towns in England and their sort of sizes at this time?
Well, there are a few surveys on this. We're going to look at one. We'll look at Jonathan Barry's, which I think is quite representative. He's a historian who's kind of given a survey of towns in this period for a ranking of them all. London, of course, was at the top of the tree by every possible measure. And this is the period when it really starts to become a great city of colossal size and international as well as just national importance. Its population had risen to 500,000 people by around 1700 to become one of the largest cities in Europe, while its share of the national population, the population of England, rose about fivefold during that time. So it really became even more dominant over the country. Huge amounts of trade and consumption went through the capital, so it had really a firm economic hold over the rest of England. Now, there weren't really any other major cities in England at this stage by international standards. If you compare provincial cities with non-capital cities in, say, Italy, France, or other parts of Europe, the historian Peter Clarke describes English towns and cities as more just market centres than national powers. But this next level below London in the hierarchy did include regional capitals of a kind. It included York, Exeter and Norwich. You might include Newcastle and Bristol, whose populations all roughly doubled from the mid-16th to the late 17th century. During Tudor times, eastern cities like Norwich and York had probably more economic power in relation to the rest, but by the 17th century, power had shifted more west to cities like Bristol, all before the later economic shift to the industrial powerhouses of the northwest in the coming centuries. And below these regional capitals, you had about 100 towns with a population of a few thousand. And finally, you had around 600 market centres with populations below 1,000, though Barry quite rightly questions in his study how urban they really were given their scale. The designation town doesn't really denote all that much of economic or social significance at this time, so they might have appeared more like slightly large villages than towns in the sense that we'd understand them.
But was this a period of growth? Were we urbanising? What sort of growth rates were we seeing?
There was growth, nothing like you would see in the coming century, but we can go through what there was and look at it in its own right. In raw population, there was huge growth in some places in the second half of the 16th century. Plymouth and Newcastle double in size from about 1530 to 1600 respectively. While the overall trajectory is definitely up, some town populations do fall. And although urban populations grew outside London, Jonathan Barry says they grew no faster than rural populations up to the mid-17th century. So up to that period, it's not just an urban phenomenon of population growth, it's more of a national phenomenon for reasons we talked about earlier.
Could you give us an idea of the population of some of these bigger places?
In the middle of this period, around 1600 after London, you had Norwich, York, Bristol and Newcastle next, though as in the Middle Ages, London was the only really big city in both absolute and relative terms. Norwich, which was second for some of this time, its population was fairly large, 15,000, but that's only 2.5 times more than King's Lynn, which was Norfolk's second largest settlement, and only 3 times its third largest, Great Yarmouth. So in relative terms, no provincial city was particularly large. Now, those cities were still the biggest by 1670, but by 1700, Exeter had overtaken York, so that great kind of northern medieval powerhouse city of York just started to see its relative population decline. It's also notable at this period that many of the fastest growing towns and cities are ports. those ancient cathedral cities aren't always growing centres of population. And of course, in the coming centuries, when industrialisation took over, you would see the growth of mega cities that would barely register on the radar as large towns at this time.
So we're talking 500,000 for London, and then places like Norwich and Bristol, the 10,000, 15,000 perhaps.
Yeah, that sort of scale.
York, that sort of scale. And of course, growing dramatically, but still the country wouldn't be described as urbanised. How urban was the country, would you say, at this point?
Not particularly, to nothing like the scale it later became. If you take the 1660s, the period of restoration of the monarchy, there's one source estimating that 25% of the population of England lived in towns. But as we said earlier, many of these so-called towns would seem scarcely bigger than villages today. A better estimate and a better measure of this might be that given by Ian Mortimer, which was that only 14% of the population lived in towns of at least 5,000 inhabitants, which I think is or has been the UN definition of a town in 1670. And of that, 9.5% was in London. So 9.5% of the population in 1670 living in London, 4.5% of the population living in towns of any significant scale. We can kind of talk about the growth of the physical area that towns covered, if you want to talk about how urban England was. There was some growth in the physical area that towns covered, but this was mostly unplanned, pretty organic. As we saw in our medieval episode, extension into suburbs wasn't uncommon, and it did continue in this era, but still in a mostly piecemeal, unplanned way. London started to have some major planned suburban growth, but it didn't really take off elsewhere until the 18th century. Michael Reed notes, for example, that not a single new street was built in Leeds between 1634 and 1767, and that Birmingham was hardly extended at all before 1700. You did have a bit of an increase of individual country houses built on the edge of cities, though, in many cases to overscape this crowding. So you had kind of tiny suburban growth in that respect. If you want to see an example of that, the Dutch House, part of Kew Palace today, that's a very good surviving example from this era.
So the obvious question is, Daniel, if they're not growing that much in physical size or area covered, but populations are doubling, how were they accommodating this population increase?
Usually just by building more within the towns. Specifically, one thing they used to do was build on the burgage plots between the buildings, between the streets. Now burgage refers to the long, very thin plots of land that might run between streets. So you might have one main road to the north, one main road to the south, and all the land between would be packaged off in thin strips. And you might have a shop at the front, perhaps a house, or perhaps a yard at the back. That's how this was packaged off in the Middle Ages. As we saw in our Reading episode, this way of dividing land continues to shape the thin layout of shops in the town centre today and in many other places. But back to the Tudor and Stuart era, you would often accommodate people there. This way of accommodating people did mean that housing might be accessed by narrow passages and alleyways rather than directly from the streets. So you wouldn't necessarily have people with a nice view facing out on the street. They might be more tucked away in areas that might previously have been hidden and perhaps underused.
So I suppose what I'm wondering now is, you're saying sort of 25% urbanisation. What does that mean for the political power of towns?
Well, we say 25%. This is towns of any size. So a lot of that is in very, very small towns. But if you want to talk about the political power, towns would have some authority in local affairs. Large towns would have a mayor or a council, but political control was very centralised in England, much more so than in most of Europe. Few individual towns had major political or tax-raising powers. There were, of course, some parliamentary boroughs returning MPs. By the end of this period, about 200 towns could return 2 MPs, but even then, the rotten boroughs, the corrupt constituencies where the landowner would just control the MP, were still growing strong. We had nothing like true representative democracy. Voting rights varied by town, and sometimes just councillors could vote. Sometimes all freemen would have the vote. But political power was still very much under control of those at the top of the social pile. Perhaps the biggest contribution of the urban areas to national politics by the end of this period was the growth in print literature and religious diversity, which did grow up in towns. London dominated these scenes in many cases, for example, in the radical politics that led to the Civil War. But provincial towns did contribute, while later Enlightenment and political cultures grew up around towns in coffee houses and other social environments.
What was the hierarchy then? What was the political hierarchy?
At the top of the pile in any town, you would have this mayor or council in many cases. The next level below them were freemen. And that, if you're a free man, that meant you had the right to trade goods, keep workshops, and usually vote for the council, the mayor, and sometimes in parliamentary elections. Now, freemen were always a minority of the adult male population of the town. So it was an exclusive club, and more rules tended to be put in place later in Stuart times to make sure that non-freemen weren't allowed to trade and that people would put the shutters down or shut down their shops when they tried to open one. At the bottom, below the freemen, you had the poor. They had no voting rights, but poor rates were collected to provide assistance or charitable donations to the very neediest, and almshouses were built to help the poorest. But the aim of this was often to keep the poor really subdued and maintain order as much as it was altruistic. And poor relief was allocated very much on a town-by-town basis. Wealthier freemen would tend to provide support for inhabitants of their own towns, but they wouldn't help outsiders. In Nottingham in the 1570s, for instance, there were specific rules put in place to prevent freemen from building housing for the poor in order to prevent people from outside the city coming in to take advantage of this.
I wouldn't want to be poor in this era.
No, definitely not.
Or any era, really, and let's be honest. What about the economy of these towns?
We certainly aren't yet at the point of mass urban industrialisation. Most towns were agricultural, market and trading centres, focused perhaps on services, and didn't have distinctive manufacturing trades of any particular significance. As Jonathan Barry puts it, towns at this time were still about, in his words, distribution, not production. Francis Pryor notes some diversification from pure agricultural market and trading economies to service industries on which some towns emerged. Towns might be service centres for perhaps their rural hinterland. Services like surgeons and brewers might be found there, especially for people visiting from the countryside for markets. You might get a coexistence, perhaps, of service and of trade and markets. By the end of this period, some towns had started to serve a new middle class of merchants and financiers growing rich from industrial growth. But most real productive industry was still in most cases rural at that time. Skilled urban artisans would usually concentrate on finishing rather than producing products.
So was there any manufacturing and industry going on at this time?
Well, there was a little. The large factories and mills of industrial England came later, but you had smaller workshops, which were very important for industrial growth in some parts of England. You can find a lot of these workshops in East Anglia with distinctive large windows to let light and let you concentrate on your work. There's a really good early 16th century example in Lavenham, in East Anglia, a region which did grow particularly wealthy on wool and led to many of the well-built surviving Tudor houses you can see there. But in general, as I said before, quite a lot of industry really shifted to rural areas in this era before that was reversed after the Industrial Revolution. There are complex reasons for this, but Francis Pryor sees a partial explanation in the restrictions imposed by town guilds, who would control manufacturing and many crafts and trades in many towns. Craftsmen had to join guilds, often with payment, to practice their trade in the town. Still, there was some specialisation, at least of trades, growing in urban areas at the end of this period. You had the very beginnings of lace in Nottingham and jewellery in Birmingham, though these cities were, of course, nowhere near as large as they would later become.
No, but it's the genesis of something that's going to become very important. Now, we've spoken quite a few times on the podcast about service towns. Can you remind us what we mean by service towns? And, are we getting towards towns like Bath or Brighton where they're sort of resorts? Are we getting those yet? Or is it too early to think about this?
Well, you had perhaps the seeds of it, though. That's almost what we're seeing a lot in this discussion, isn't it? You're getting the seeds of things that are coming later. And I think that's probably the case here. We had just those first initial stages of spa towns, which grew later into, in many cases, those great resort and entertainment and leisure towns. Now, they owed any popularity really to the pseudo-medical practice of taking the water, which we talked about so much in the Brighton episode. And even Charles II was told to go and drink water at Llandrindod Wells by his doctor, as well as some of the later famous spa towns. Epsom also grew briefly as a spa town. Tunbridge Wells is probably the most notable example of 17th century resort growth, with the spring discovered in 1606 and the early town established around this. I shouldn't overstate how much happened in this era, though. There wasn't a lot of physical development to these towns as resorts compared with the later growth of spa and resort towns under the Georgians. While some people were visiting Bath in the springs, a visitor to Bath in 1705 called it one of the poorest cities in England and noted how little accommodation and entertainment there was there. But I think maybe the critical point to take from that is not necessarily what wasn't there, but the fact that someone felt the need to comment on it, that there was clearly the demand created in this era for what would come later.
So again, we're starting to see the seeds of what would come. Okay, I want to think about the sort of the impact of the historic events that you mentioned earlier on cities, on towns. Now, you said earlier that the Reformation had a big impact. Now, I think of the Reformation, I think of lots of churches and buildings being destroyed and ripped down. But you said you think this had a bigger impact than just that destruction.
Well, yeah, I mean, certain destruction of buildings was important, but it did go wider than that. We tend to think of the dissolution of the monasteries probably in respect of Henry VIII's personal story and its impact on high politics and religion in England. But it was also a massive change for urban life in England and the lives of ordinary people in general. For one thing, the church was a huge landowner in towns. One estimate is that 16% of the urban area of England had been monastic buildings, and these were suddenly reallocated, sold off, or demolished in a great many cases. For church buildings themselves, some were taken over by municipal authorities and continued as churches, but some were put to other uses, like being turned into warehouses. In Malmesbury, one merchant bought the abbey from the king and used loads of it for weaving cloth, but sometimes churches were just demolished and clearances might allow for new housing. The impact of the Reformation was also financial, as less money was being siphoned into church coffers and church endowments and able to be spent elsewhere by the state. And this did result in lots of new civic buildings like schools, plus some wider civic improvements like bridges, water supplies and street improvements.
Do you think it was good then? Do you think it was better to get rid of monasteries and have these perhaps more useful buildings?
You could see it in those terms to an extent, but the Reformation certainly wasn't just some great centrally planned urban regeneration project. They did leave a real service gap because religious houses had previously taken care of old, disabled and ill people. That service was in many cases withdrawn, though new almshouses might have made up for that to some extent in some places. But even away from that, from the church buildings and direct services, there was also a definite decline in religious festivals and pageantry in towns. Michael Reed points out an increasing secularization of English towns following this period. So for some people, towns became just that little bit less fun.
Okay. Because I suppose before this period, churches were pretty much the biggest and most important buildings in any settlement.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
From the most impressive construction projects. So from this era on, how much religious or church building went on?
Up to that period, there'd been a really long period of ecclesiastical building projects, but that just ended for really over a century. Church building only recommenced to any great scale over a century later during the Civil War, mainly to repair damage caused in that conflict. But the biggest single revival of church building projects during the period we're covering today was in London to repair damage after the Great Fire of London. Think of Christopher Wren and his neoclassical design of St Paul's Cathedral, which is really unique and was built specifically to replace the old Gothic cathedral that perished in the fire. And of course, so many of our old cathedrals are Gothic in nature that St Paul's really does stand out as distinctive, having been built in that era. That plus Wren's other churches in London, classical in style, they contrast really with the Gothic of the preceding churches, and even today are still very distinctive among English churches.
Yeah, they are. And they're quite fantastic. Yes. So level of construction didn't lead to an increase necessarily in the number of churches, but replacing churches which were lost. So it was sort of stable, but not.
Well,
Now,
in a very specific way. I mean, we're talking about London, but London wouldn't have been typical. London had the specific impetus of the Great Fire.
this requirement, yeah.
Yeah, there were classical designs in some other towns where churches were burned down, but this is fairly unique for this period in London.
Fairly exceptional. And I suppose so we've covered the destruction of the Reformation and then the resulting changes in emphasis in what was built in towns. The other major period of destruction that you've mentioned is the Civil War. Can you tell us a bit about an overview of if you can, the Civil War very briefly, and sort of the impact that it's having on cities?
Of course, well, the Civil War was fought in the middle of the 17th century, very basically between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the Crown. There were myriad facts that went into it. We've talked about religious divides, political disputes as well, across more than one country, England, Scotland and Ireland, and at different stages. For our purposes, one of the most important things is just how deadly and destructive this was to England, because it was a major war fought within England, which is quite unusual. One of the staples of Ye Olde Guide of this podcast is to talk about the various battles and sieges that took place in different towns in England. And this really was a harrowing time in England for that respect. About a quarter of adult men fought, and 4.5% of the population died. It's staggering casualty figures. And the impact on towns was really correspondingly devastating. Lots of damage left people homeless. Colchester, during its famous siege, which we talked about in our episode on Colchester, lost 193 houses, which lay derelict for many years and had 13 churches damaged, while the great cathedrals of Lichfield and Lincoln were damaged. Towns are often plundered by armies with breakdown of law and order. Huge numbers of inhabitants, particularly men, might be slaughtered indiscriminately. There's an account of such an event in Bolton in 1644, where the marauding royalist cavalrymen pursued the poor, killing, stripping and spoiling, as an account says, all the men they could find. There were economic impacts too. There was heavy taxation to pay for armies, and there was the disruption of trade and communications between towns, which meant you couldn't buy and sell as easily between them. The other side, I suppose, is there was some construction in towns as well. Many towns were newly fortified and garrisoned. In particular, there were more fortifications against artillery, but like in Colchester, Newcastle and Hull, artillery hadn't been used so much in previous wars in England. But many of these were built quickly, these defensive fortifications, and not much survives. Newark-on-Trent has some, well, we discussed in our Reading episode, the mound and the redoubt that remain there from the Civil War defences, built well away from the medieval town.
And in the long term, what impact did the Civil War have on towns?
Well, some of the specific physical damage did remain for years. Artillery damage from the siege in Colchester, it's still used as a tourist selling point in Colchester Castle now, as is the damage at St Botolph's Priory there. Plus, many of the great medieval castles were deliberately destroyed or heavily damaged afterwards, so they couldn't be used again, like Nottingham's, like we spoke about recently. In the longer term, there was a definite slowdown in urban development, really because this era lacked that political stability and the economic resources that you'd need to invest in the physical fabric of towns. Now, some historians do suggest a slight counterpoint, that there wasn't a complete breakdown of society or local government like you might have had in other wars in other countries. The need to fortify that we mentioned earlier did spur some improved urban planning. Demand for medical care and weapons helped these specific trades in urban areas. But really, there's no doubt that overall the Civil War had hugely negative short and long-term impacts on urban England.
Yeah, I suppose if you think about more recent history that we've got very good record of post-Second World War rebuilding, the challenge was the cities had large areas of destruction, and the country had very severe rationing on materials like steel and had competing economic imperatives. So you could imagine it was similar at the time. The economic resources would not have been there to rebuild what was lost, and it would take time. So I suppose you've had these very clear historic events that have had their influence, but I guess there were other dangers too at the time.
Certainly fire.
Of course,
It's hard to appreciate just how big a danger fires were to towns at this period. They were at constant peril. Numerous towns were burnt pretty much to ground in this period. Now, of course, the most famous one is the Great Fire of London, and the Great Fire of London continues to impact London today. It's one of the main reasons why so little of medieval London exists. There are fewer than a dozen medieval buildings left in the city of London. This is also due to the dissolution of the monasteries, industrial development, and the Blitz, of course, but no question the Great Fire had a massive role in this. During a period that's been termed by historians as the Great Rebuilding, which we're going to talk about a lot more in the next episode because it's very important, there was new mass rebuilding of buildings in towns, which increased safety standards. After the Great Fire of London, there were stringent new rules introduced for new buildings there, specifying that houses had to be built of brick or stone. Now, although this law applies specifically to London, and Eric Wood has noted that many other towns did adopt the same measures, and then that contributed to a national increase in the use of brick and stone and a decline in the use of timber. So you're even starting in this period to get just the beginnings of kind of modern building materials in the brick that kind of has come to define England in so many ways. As well as fires, plagues were horribly common. There were no outbreaks quite as anywhere near as extreme, I should say, as the Black Death in the Middle Ages, but still lots of outbreaks of bubonic plague in different areas. When they happened, towns might set rules to try and keep the plague out. In the 1580s, inhabitants of Nottingham were banned from visiting Derby or allowing people from Derby to visit because of a plague outbreak there. It was a really big fear for everyone.
It's really interesting you talked about the laws coming out of damaged by fire, this period of the Great Rebuilding, because of course that's an essential part of urban life, the requirement of neighbours to have to adhere to rules to prevent this kind of disaster. And I guess that's exactly the kind of thing you're going to talk about in the next part, because you're going to be talking about the social structures of towns, facilities, transports, and things like that. So tell what are you going to talk about in the next part?
Well, today's been a bit of a kind of an overview, context, major events of the period, how they impacted on towns. Next time, we're going to go into more of a detailed discussion on what towns actually felt like, the buildings themselves, the layouts of towns, and much more about the specific changes that happened there.
Fantastic. I can't wait myself. Well, thank you everyone for listening. And if you have any comments or feedback on this episode, you can leave it at our website, yeoldeguide.com. Or you can leave it wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Apple or Spotify, both great places to leave ratings and reviews. It's been a fantastic episode, Daniel. Can't wait for the next one. So it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Thanks for listening.
Very much.